Baldur's Gate 3 is a gem in the world of role-playing games, and it brings us a sense of belonging to a wonderful community, yet it's far from perfect. So why are we loving it despite all imperfections? To answer the question, I've divided my impressions in two parts, the positives and the negatives. Join me as we explore them one by one. As a passionate D&D player and dungeon master, I was thrilled by the abundance of D&D tropes that fill the game. I was so inspired after completing the first act that I even considered running a tabletop campaign based on its content. Mind flayers, goblins, gnolls, ancient ruins and enchanted swamps with a mandatory witch in the heart of the bog, it's a rich tapestry of familiar D&D elements. Owlbears and giant spiders, and there is even something akin to a beholder. I thought the massive goblin dungeon would be the end of the first act, but the game surprised me and delivered even more content. This goblin-occupied temple could rival with any final dungeon in typical D&D campaign, like The Lost Mind of Andelver. This game is constantly over-delivering. Most importantly, all these elements are intricately tied to the game's plot lines, and your action influences the story development. The game even allows you to make the classic player move, venturing into a completely different location, leaving the dungeon master to mourn over unused prepared material.
Sometimes you're the windshield.
Speaking of cliches that bring a smile to our faces, I felt quite clever when I found a rope in the game. Aha, I thought to myself, this is one of the most useful items in D&D. It can help you to cross rivers, climb mountains, descend into wells, yet how disappointed I was to see an unused rope in my inventory at the end of the game. I felt foolish. The 50-foot rope is as familiar a D&D trope as goblins, mimics and mind flayers. Look, in 2022, Wizards of the Coast released an MTG set featuring D&D, including cards for Shadowheart, Asterion, and the rope. This rope has not one but 3 usage mods. That's 3 more options that Larian provides. And maybe it's a silly thing to complain about, but I think this is a missed opportunity. And I hope you don't miss the opportunity to subscribe and help us to reach our goal of 1000 subscribers. We are firm believers in making D&D related entertaining videos that don't waste your time. Thank you. Another aspect I really liked was that early equipment grants small yet enjoyable bonuses, making you think about character builds. This equipment isn't too powerful to break the game, as items often do in the third act, but any D&D player would be delighted to buy or loot interesting items that immediately impact gameplay at the early levels. After seeing early itemization, I was inspired and asked myself, why am I not rewarding my players with similar magic items? I'm being ridiculous! Additionally, weapon abilities deserve special mention. My favorite is Rush Attack, which is available for polearms and longswords. It allows you to close the distance even after your movement has ended and applies a strong debuff. There are no weapon actions like this in the current D&D edition, but they are planned for the next edition. I think it's a great idea because it makes the choice of weapons meaningful and interesting. I'm looking forward to stealing some of these weapon effects for my home games. On the flip side, sometimes item effects described in tooltips don't match reality. It feels like they were hastily written at the very last moment before the game's released. You can never trust the description because it might be inaccurate or even work the opposite way. Everything needs to be tested, but testing is difficult because the game has target dummies, but they are useless, taking 0 damage. Of course, I understand that BG3 is a huge game, it won't be possible to implement everything perfectly, but the game was in early access for 3 years and it seems to me that much of this time the possibilities of conducting a romance with your companions were optimized. For example, some feats, the DC of Battlemaster maneuvers, Swordlock spell slot conversion to sorcery points, either partially or completely don't work. I'm sure Larian will fix most of these bugs over time, but at the moment they tarnish the experience of an otherwise outstanding game. Despite the presence of some noticeable bugs and issues, it's fascinating to note that Baldur's Gate 3 has undergone substantial class revisions. These revisions bring an exciting freshness to familiar classes, making the gameplay more engaging. And there are also interactions between elements and a ton of magical items, each contributing to a creation of powerful and fun character builds. Many of these are not a part of current Dungeons & Dragons edition. This ever-evolving landscape invites us to rediscover existing classes, breathing fresh life into them. For example, for Shadowheart I used a fairly strong support build from 5e, but the equipment that provides bonuses on heal made this build even more powerful. It's really fun to make character builds in this game. Looking at the cinematics and the gripping start of the game, I was fully convinced that efficiency would be key during gameplay. I felt like a Fallout scenario with water chip. If you don't deliver it in time, say goodbye to your home village. My suspicion was confirmed when during a long rest the entire party began feeling unwell. Lae'zel approached with a knife, warning that she'd kill everyone who showed signs of transformation. This set a serious tone. I formed my party to benefit greatly from short rest and increase the number of short rests with a bard. I think I got through the entire first act in 3 or 4 long rests. I thought this was the optimal way to play, but it turned out to be quite the opposite. The game started stacking companion events, unable to process the accumulated reactions in one go. Quests began glitching. I'm quite certain I ruined the entire quest chain with Halcyon. Needless to say, this was highly disappointing. So don't rush the game, take your time. Undoubtedly, it's been a while since I felt such exhilarating sensations of exploring new locations in games. For instance, right at the game's beginning, remember those doors leading to the abandoned crypt? I was fortunate enough to open those doors on my first try with a natural 20. I also had the audacity to venture into the area with just Shadowheart at my side. Needless to say, it was a very intense exploration with looking around every corner where unequal battles or failed rolls to check traps awaited me. As time passed and my full party assembled, the sense of danger waned, but the game continued to delight with numerous secret areas. You'd often discover this through careful reading of found records. I felt a similar thrill only when I was exploring my first goblin cave during my very first D&D campaign. As the story progresses, players gain access to the Illithid power tree, which contains a vast array of potent abilities. Frankly, most of them, in my opinion, transform the game from something somewhat resembling D&D into something entirely different, and suddenly the game doesn't offer you alternative options. But what if my characters are an anti-Illithid group? What if, for role-playing reasons, I'd prefer not to surrender my humanity? The only other option is not to engage with the system at all. That's what I've done. I'm not judging anyone for their desire to delete enemies with the press of the button, but I personally prefer more down-to-earth experiences. Unfortunately, the game lacks a system that offers an alternative to Illithid Pass. What if we strongly opposed Illithid and got access to Githyanki abilities instead? I understand this would place an additional burden on developers, but it's something I would have implemented in my own D&D campaign as a GM if my players didn't want to interact with Illithid powers. I started this game with a bias against the Underdark zone. When I first realized that the party's journey would lead us through this area, I cited heavily. Let me explain why. My initial exposure to the world of the Underdark began with Salvatore's novel about the Dark Elf. At the time, I had just finished reading The Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion, so I could barely handle 2 chapters describing the dark abyss of darkness, the treacherous spider customs, and the cruel practices of the Drow. That was so edgy I couldn't handle it. And that's coming from a teenager who loved listening to Evanescence and Darkseid. Years later, as a dungeon master, I explored various campaigns for my home games, and I came across the Out of the Abyss campaign, one that entirely takes place in the Underdark. Allow me to quote the #1 piece of advice from Reddit regarding preparing for this campaign. Prep work needed to run Out of the Abyss is staggering. It is recommended for nobody but pro DMs with a lot of time on their hands. In fact, writing your own adventure would likely be less time-consuming. So that was no fun at all. Even in the recent D&D movie, the Underdark didn't seem like an interesting zone. The dragon was cool, but the zone itself, meh. But let me tell how BG3 completely transformed my perception of the Underdark. I was greeted with a dark yet vibrant zone. It was intriguing and dangerous, filled with secrets, puzzles and rewards. I loved the arcane punk mage tower, the Myconid zone, and of course the ancient surrounded by lava Grimforge. From a biased skeptic, I turned into admirer. I believe we should highly value books, movies and games that awaken new ideas and inspire us. For me, Baldur's Gate 3 is precisely such a game. It takes us through uncharted territories, challenging our preconceptions and surprising us at every turn. But what's also sad to see is that many of my favorite spells did not transfer well from tabletop D&D to Baldur's Gate. What spell do you think will be on the list? Check out this video to see if we'll agree or disagree. Until then, may your dice rolls be ever in your favor.